The Israeli-Palestinian territory is the stage of one of our modern world's most infamous and notably violent political disputes. As two opposing peoples, Arabs and Jews have laid claim to the same small stretch of land. They are deadlocked in a state of conflict with no viable resolution. Today it is commonly viewed as a two-sided affair. However, most fail to consider the consequential role that Great Britain played in its recent history. The modern story of Israel and Palestine begins in Europe with the birth of Zionism. Zionism, in its infancy, was a Jewish political movement led by Theodor Herzl, which represented the desire of self-determination or a national identity for the Jewish diaspora around the world. As a milestone of this movement, in 1897 he founded the first Zionist Congress, an assembly where over 200 members across 20 countries gathered under this common sentiment. No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews, Herzl wrote. Wherever they live in perceptible numbers, they are more or less persecuted. Their equality before the law, granted by statute, has become practically a dead letter. He supposed that without a material home and as the concurrent subjects of discrimination, the Jewish people would readily agree on the establishment of a unified state. His objective was Jerusalem, occupied by the then visibly declining Ottoman Empire. As these ambitions began to materialize in European politics over the next few decades, it became furthermore clear that the Zionist goal would require a momentous shift of authority in the Middle East. This would come in the form of World War I, and as this ideology began to pervade into European politics, the war to end all wars would lay the foundation for Herzl's dream. As a nation, Great Britain became the greatest proponent of this cause. One of the most notable figures in this process was the British Jew Chaim Weizmann, a member of the General Zionist Council and later appointed head of the British Zionist Commission. His scientific assistance to the Allied forces in World War I brought him in close contact with British leaders, placing him in the seat of influence. As he began to view the defeat of Germany and its allies, including the Ottoman Empire, as inevitable, it simultaneously constituted his logic for its dismemberment, and ultimately he began pushing for the acquisition of Palestine, the land surrounding Jerusalem. Eventually, Great Britain would appease to the growing desire of Zionists like Weizmann, but today many are skeptical of the true motives behind Britain's impulsive decision. Although there are many likely theories, the forefront most likely was their desire to win the fight in World War I.
So the British are desperate for any little increment of strength they can get in this titanic battle with Germany. And also they just thought that they exercised this enormous subterranean influence over media, for example, throughout the world. And that there was this kind of great Jewish imagine an octopus with tentacles that encompass the entire globe.
The official 67-word document was drafted by British Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur Balfour and received by Lord Rothschild, another prominent member of Britain's Jewish community, in a letter marked for November 2, 1917. It stated, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. There had now been established a standard at which most European Jews were content with. They would be granted their home in Palestine." However, the document was neither firm nor straightforward enough to provide a sturdy and inclusive framework for the development of this contentious territory. The Balfour Declaration failed on various fronts due to the ambiguous communication of its objectives. Its implications would later reflect such. But it wasn't the only factor that contributed to Britain's historic miscommunication. Thus, while the premise of the document prompted reasonable grounds for celebration in the Jewish community, the application of it, in addition to Great Britain's conflicting resolution, would be far more complex. The first aforementioned factor was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. During World War I, an imperialistic British government looked to expand their sphere of influence to the Middle East. This included Palestine, an area of particular political interest which fell under the sovereignty of Great Britain. Although a formal mandate would be granted by the newly formed League of Nations after the war, this agreement effectively did so beforehand. So with this ensuing document, they had established that the Jewish national home would not in fact belong to the Jews. Rather, His Majesty would expand his dominion. But this wouldn't mark the end of Britain's Middle Eastern dealings during World War I. Their second secret negotiation was a series of letters exchanged between Henry McMahon, a high British commissioner residing in Egypt, and Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, throughout late 1915 and early 1916. The letters were proposed as an incentive to Ali. In exchange for the provocation of an internal rebellion within the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain promised Arabian independence after World War I, implying the political concession of Palestine. The insurgence was a success. However, the exchange was later denied by the British government, and its promises were subsequently nullified. The disintegration of this agreement would form the basis of many future conflicts in the Middle East. Regardless of any positive short-term impacts, which garnered support for Great Britain's increased effort in World War I, they had bound themselves to three contradictory documents: the Balfour Declaration, which promised Palestine to the Jews; the McMahon-Hussein letters, which promised it to the Arabs; and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which promised it to themselves. Regardless of the underlying circumstances, European Jews jumped at the opportunity to begin populating the British Mandate under the Balfour Declaration.
The dreams come in, brought in by the immigrants who arrive in increasing boatloads every week. For young and old, the dream is the same: a country of their own that most of them call the Promised Land.
During the succeeding decade, 1920 to 1929, approximately 100,000 Jewish immigrants entered Palestine. In absolute terms, the Jewish population more than doubled. However, conflict quickly arose between the settlers and their Palestinian neighbors. The Palestine Arab press warned that the British government was introducing Jews into the country to push the Arabs into the sea and finish them. Increasingly antagonistic views of the other side surfaced in media and common exchange. Karl Rizwan, an Arab author, describes this climate. Must all Palestine become one day like this, including the holy city of Jerusalem? Tel Aviv is an ulcer eating into our country. If it is what the Jews want to make of Palestine, I wish my children dead. We do not mind poverty, but we weep when our peace is taken away. To the Arabs, who believed a Jewish majority would mean the extinction of their culture, what Great Britain had done, with a simple letter, permanently altered the course of their existence. They had inhabited these lands for centuries, and now it seemed as though their greatest fears have come to fruition. The fervor of Zionism was only further intensified by the stark increase in anti-Semitism that spread throughout Europe in the 1930s. The rise of Nazism in 1929 led to a wave of 250,000 Jews immigrating to Palestine over the coming decade. But the British, who had done very little to prevent conflict, oversaw as this mass emigration was met with an equally counteractive and violent response. Notably, the Hebron Massacre, an Arab revolt of 1936, which led to over 1,300 casualties between the Arabs and the Jews in coalition with the British. Finally, recognizing the scale of this dispute, the British sought to mitigate their impacts on the Arab populations in Palestine, as they formulated a few agreements in hope of restoring order. Most impactful was a White Paper Compromise in May of 1939, which was delivered in order to appease Arab nationalists and bring an end to the British Mandate in Palestine over the coming decade. Also, as Britain entered World War II, the White Paper Compromise may have also served the strategic purpose of preventing Arabs from allying with their enemy, Germany. In effect, it severely restricted Jewish immigration to 75,000 over the next 5 years, after which the consent of Arab leadership would be needed to further Jewish immigration. Purchase of land in Palestine by Jews was severely curtailed and supervised, and the first steps toward local self-government were to be taken after World War I. But at a time in Europe when Jews particularly needed to leave, many viewed this compromise as a death warrant. Thus, the Jews felt justifiably hopeless. Meanwhile, the Arabs, who did not want to wait for independence, expressed similar discontent. As promised in the White Paper of 1939, the British withdrew from Palestine in 1948, ultimately deciding that the territory was far more trouble than it was worth. On May 14th, Israel, the Jewish state, established their independence. One day later, 5 Arab nations joined the Palestinian Arabs in an attempt to gain back the land they had lost, marking the start of the First Arab-Israeli War. Within a year, the underestimated army of Israel won, getting most of the territory representative of its current state. To preserve self-interest, Great Britain attempted to please 2 conflicting entities, making them greatly responsible for the ongoing struggle between them. Thus, the key to understanding such a fiercely contested matter lies in the failure of Britain to effectively communicate set intentions during their imperialistic attempt to transform the Middle East. So despite the notion that this conflict is a two-sided affair, history shows that it is not that simple. The people of Israel and Palestine instead suffer from the curse of circumstance, a force that has hopelessly entangled them in the mess of imperialism and broken promises from a century before.